I think too many GMs overcomplicate world building. We think we have to be Tolkien or Martin. We envision worlds with diverse cultures and languages, imagine deep lore extending millennia into the past, and complex political intrigues. Usually, this process begins by sitting down with a blank piece of paper, jotting down some squiggly lines that vaguely resemble a coastline, some isometric mountain peaks here and there, and then a laborious process of making up a dozen or so locations, towns, villages, fortifications, what have you. Every one of us knows the pain, the sting of betrayal when our players seem utterly disinterested in most of it. Why even bother putting in work for these ungrateful sods who don't even want to visit the House of the Remnants high in the misty peaks of the Rashkul Mountains? Then we make another mistake. We retcon our story to have an entire quest line that railroads the players into going to locations just because we think they're cool. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Upstairs Table. I'm Andrew, a GM, and I'm here to help you be a better storyteller at your next session. If you've had problems with railroading in a recent game, leave a comment below and tell me about what happened. So what are we supposed to do? World building can be fun, sure, but it can feel like a lot of wasted effort unless we railroad our players completely. At that point, you shouldn't be GMing, you should be writing a book. So let's look at railroading versus keeping the campaign from going off the rails, staying flexible with your plans, and how being lazy could make you a better master at your table. All right, let's talk about railroading again, because for all the great videos already out there that discuss fixing this problem, there still seems to be an issue for a lot of GMs at a lot of tables. I think a big part of this is a sort of mental tug of war GMs struggle with, where sure, we all know railroading is bad, but losing control of the group and having your campaign get derailed is also really bad. If you feel stuck between these two ideas, you're not alone. I battle with these ideas constantly as a GM. They make me doubt not just my last session, but the rest of the planning I've spent hours putting together. In reality, being on the rails is generally okay and probably a good thing for new GMs. But how much is too much? Like many things in life, the solution to railroading is not an all or nothing. The key is moderation. So let's start by defining bad railroading. Bad railroading is removing autonomy from the players, either by not giving them enough choices or by making their choices meaningless. Role-playing games like D&D essentially boil down to a series of choices. Our job as the GM is to make those choices clear, interesting, and meaningful. Players want the story to change because of what they chose to do. Good railroading, on the other hand, is creating compelling stories with defined goals and clear expectations for what kind of outcomes might arise. So make it fun, make it important, and make it matter to how the story ends. Imagine a whole tree of a story with a trunk that forks into branches, that forks into leaves. Every path ends in a leaf. There's always going to be a conclusion. But there are almost limitless variations because each leaf is a bit different from every other leaf. Now, understand what I'm not telling you to do. I am not saying you, as the GM, need to build out storylines for every possible branch of our tree. Just be ready for the players to pick a branch you didn't expect, accept their choice, and adjust the story accordingly. Don't waste your effort and lock yourself into a specific idea, because when you're making it all up, you can have complete flexibility. Now, there are a few things you can do to increase flexibility, reduce railroading, and tell better, more dynamic stories. First, be patient when world building. Build only what you need. If inspiration strikes, make notes so you don't forget, but then move on. Work out of a starting town until you're at least 5th level in 5e. If you're using a different system, stay there until your players reach a sort of mid-tier power spike or getting into those more powerful mid-levels. If your players' characters are content in the area they're in, you can stay there as long as you like. Great stories and great campaigns don't have to traverse the entire world. You can find adventure in your own backyard. I think Harry Potter is a really good example of this, but I'm actually going to save that for another video and really dive into that in depth. Doing this is going to reduce work for you, the GM, but it's also going to simplify things for the players. There's fewer NPCs to keep track of, fewer locations to remember. It all means your players have more time to focus on role-playing, learning their spells, telling a part of their story. The only locations you're going to need in a starting town is an inn or a tavern, someplace for the players to stay, a shop for them to buy things, and then a town hall or a guardhouse, some kind of authority that's enforcing the local rules. For NPCs, you need the people in those buildings, an innkeeper, a shopkeeper, and the local authority, who can even be a mentor. Everything else can be made later during the session as the players need it. Then spend the rest of your prep time really diving into the villain. This is where we define the real story, the trunk of the tree from which all the branches are going to spread. There is no story without conflict, and there is no conflict without a villain, even an inanimate one. Build a villain with compelling goals. Whatever they want to be or do, it has to be fun and interesting. Connect it to your players' backstories if you can. But above all, you must make sure that their plan will absolutely work, unless the heroes intervene. Then, figure out what the villain needs in order to accomplish their goals. In other words, figure out what could be sabotaged by the players to delay the evil plot, or even coerce the villain out of hiding so the players can take them down. Facing random waves of encounters to level up and then facing a big bad in a final showdown's boring. Give the players a stronger sense of involvement by making every quest focus on reducing the big bad's power. Let your players steal the Death Star plans. Let them destroy a Horcrux. Let them cut off supply lines. Sway the allegiance of some fringe ally. Or give them a MacGuffin to bring to empower the last fortress of resistance. I'm a firm believer that the best way to learn is by doing, so let's go through my process for making a low-level adventure that could launch into a full campaign.
Let's start by simply labeling what we want to do. So we definitely want to create a village or a starting town. And then we need to create a villain. I'm using a program called Scrivener. They don't sponsor me or anything, but I really like this program, so I'd say give it a shot and check it out. If you're a DM or a GM who uses a digital screen, uses your laptop or a tablet as your DM screen, I highly recommend looking at this program because it could really help you out a lot. So under the village or starting town, what are we going to need? We're going to need an inn. We're going to need a shop. And we're going to need an authority. We'll go to the villain later. Let's start out here. In the Benbow Tavern, what we want to think about is what kinds of things are going to happen there, what's going to be available there, what do the players need to be able to access. But we want to think about it from a story perspective. There's lots of great videos already out there. They're going to talk about how to do creation of these types of things. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on what I do when it comes to story. So I think that the innkeeper probably knows almost everyone around town because this is both an inn and a tavern. Lots of people are going to be coming in here after the day is off. If there's gossip to be found, if there's information to be known, the innkeeper knows it. But let's think about how we want to implement some of the things that we've talked about today as far as railroading. I want to make sure that there's plenty of options for things that they could do. So that means there needs to be a lot of information available to the players for what kinds of things could be done. This is also where we're going to be setting up the conflict. So let's mark that here. We'll move on to the shop for now until we can craft the villain and really get the crux of our story dealt with, and then we can go back to the tavern and decide what information will be given there. So for the shop, we need to decide what items are available to buy. What does the shopkeeper know? Probably will know less than the tavern keeper because there's not going to be as much foot traffic from the town in and out, but their job may give them some kind of unique information. So that's something we're going to want to come back to when it comes to presenting the story to the players. Local authority or mentor, they're going to know crucial information, important information about the villain, letting us know a little bit about the villain's backstory, because we don't want a villain who monologues in the big fight scene, so we need to find a way to get that information to the players in a way that isn't forceful and isn't kind of like this cutaway cinematic that they have to sit through while we describe. We want to make it more interactive than that. Let's think about some of our favorite villains from other movies, or even favorite characters from other movies. I like the idea of how in Star Wars the villain isn't trying to come into power and take over. They already have power and they're trying to prevent the uprising. That's a nice little twist on that. That's something we could work with. We could also look at something like Django Unchained is a great example where we have a villain in Monsieur Candy who isn't actively trying to mess up our main character's plans. They kind of have their own thing going, but they have something that the main character wants or needs and need to get out of their control, and they don't want to give it. That's another way to do it as well. And I kind of like that for a low level idea, because it could be that there is this broader world out there that needs help from the adventurers, but in order to face that danger, in order to face that conflict, they're going to have to get something first. Maybe the powerful artifact that normally we'd find in a dungeon run or from a mentor character, however you might give that item to them. What if instead they're able to get that item from the villain? With that, I'm choosing this story because I like this sort of background for a villain. I'm a big fan of Django Unchained, and I think it could be a really cool way to bring a villain into a D&D story. But it does present a challenge, which is we talked about how the villain needs to have goals. Yeah, we want to maintain power, we want to not give up that item to the adventurers, but how can we apply that in terms of a villain goal? And I think it's the villain has just recently come into power, and they're going to be very wary, very cautious. You know what? Recently come into power? I don't like that. Let's do something a little bit more interesting. Recently quelled a rebellion. So they've been in power for a little while, but they've just had that power challenged and successfully stopped that challenge from succeeding. So they've recently quelled a rebellion, and that has them suspicious. They're always looking over their shoulder. They're very, very cautious, even in their inner circle, wondering, did I get all of them? Did I get all the rotten eggs in that pass? Or are there a few who've snuck through? So in this case, the villain's not looking to gain power, they're looking to solidify power and make sure that they remain powerful, and that not only have they survived this recent uprising, but they've also been able to increase their power and strengthen the resiliency and the endurance of that power against a potential future rebellion. Hopefully so much so that the future rebellion never even happens because the people are too scared. They feel put in their place. And I think that's a very, very good goal for a villain. To me, that's interesting because to me, that's very real and realistic to somebody who is in a position of power. When you're not in power, you want to gain power, but if you're in power, you need to find a way to keep it. And keeping power is often harder than getting that power in the first place. So I think this has some really good opportunities for us. So let's think about some of the ways they're going to achieve that goal. That's our next step. What methods is the villain going to use, or what things are supporting this goal by the villain? Specifically, with the thought, what could the players sabotage? So I think one thing is if you've just quelled a rebellion, you're probably worried about infrastructure. Rebellion typically is going to have some damage. There's going to be riots. There's going to be broken buildings in the town. Um, we can picture scenes of the aftermath of a full-on Civil War scale rebellion or revolt, and because of that, infrastructure and trying to return things to normal is going to be a big part of solidifying power. If the people are happy, if things are working well, if the rich are able to get richer, if the poor believe there's an opportunity for them to get out of poverty, they're going to be a lot more content and a lot less likely to rebel. So providing that infrastructure and fixing that infrastructure is going to be a big way that that power could be solidified. And that's easy to exploit. The players could easily have any number of quests where they're trying to prevent the infrastructure from growing. The players could organize a union strike or something along those lines. So we could find a way to either stop laborers or convince them to turn against their employer. Again, you don't ever want one solution to something. The idea is the players might see an opportunity to get the work to stop. Let's see, what's another thing that someone who's trying to solidify power wants to do? I said they're going to be looking over their back, even in their inner circle. Their inner circle is going to be comprised of a handful of people that the villain is watching very closely, very, very closely, to see if there's any kind of tinge of rebellion. Now, here's the problem. If the villain were to remove any of these members of the inner circle, they are weakening themselves, because any good inner circle is going to be composed of people who provide some level of support to the power of the villain, either directly or indirectly. Physically with armies, economically with agriculture, whatever it may be, your inner circle is always going to be composed of people who are supporting your power. So, what if a member of the inner circle was vulnerable to the players? Not all of them, most of them are going to be loyal, but with a little bit of some clues, maybe from the tavern keeper or something like that, something he overhears in conversation, maybe among the faithful, an otherwise faithful member of the inner circle, maybe they're just open-minded enough to hear the players out should a conversation happen. There could be another way to do that as well. We always want multiple ways to let the players do it in the way they feel. You could assassinate a member of the inner circle, because if you've got a tight-knit group of people who are supposed to be protecting each other, who are all supporting the villain because the villain's power is going to protect them, that's kind of normal for an inner circle. So if you were to assassinate a member, they're going to feel less safe. They're going to start to feel like the villain can't protect them, and that might sow some seeds of mistrust and make that inner circle start to fall apart a little bit, thereby weakening the power that the villain can bring. Let's think of one more. What's one more thing that the players could do? You could do 5 or 10 of these, but let's just do 3. So if you're trying to solidify power, what's another thing you could do? You're probably going to increase policing of the people. That's a common thing when someone feels when someone in power feels their power is threatened. They're going to crack down with law enforcement, usually with a strong propaganda message behind it. That way, your citizens who are more moderate or sympathetic to you being in charge of them those citizens are going to be happy that you're promoting order. You're preventing their shops from being broken into. You're preventing their homes from being broken into by the revolutionaries. That's going to be happening, I would think, in this kind of situation, especially with having just quelled a rebellion. That crackdown is happening crazy hard right now. And the players have a number of ways that they could exploit that. One is you've got the more radical side of the community who probably sympathized with the revolutionaries but didn't have the money or the time or the physical health capability, or for whatever reason they weren't able to actually actively participate in the revolution, but there's still sympathizers out there. You don't need to convince them that this crackdown of law and order is bad. They know it's bad. And the faithful, on the other end of the spectrum, the extremely supportive people who are okay with the villain being in power, who were against the revolution when it happened, you're not really going to sway them at all. The trick to any kind of political intrigue is how you control the moderate majority, the people in the middle. So the players could use this crackdown of law enforcement to start a propaganda campaign. They could start a propaganda campaign. They could work directly with the people and do lots of role-playing encounters where they're meeting with lots of different citizens of the community to start to build this psychological army, I guess you could say, where they're going to be trying to sway those moderate citizens into how the crackdown is wrong. And this is typically going to lead to the players trying to start a new revolution. Instead of taking on the big bad by themselves and just trying to kill them and move on with life and take whatever treasure he or she may have, the players will try to get the whole community behind them and really isolate the villain. That's a good option to have. The other thing they might do, though, is kind of a different type of subversion. If there's a police crackdown, that means they're going to be working very hard to crack down on every little crime possible. What if your players are a little bit more chaotic in their alignment? They could go out there and start committing a whole bunch of crimes and trying to tie up these law enforcement officials and force them to waste their time on a wild goose chase, which would enable the actual centralized power to weaken. So start a wild goose chase. And typically what you're looking for from a story perspective in here is you're looking for this to be done to an extent where you can justifiably say in the story that maybe there's fewer guards around the villain in the final fight because this wild goose chase has required more officials to go out on the street to continue this crackdown, and as more and more get wrapped up having to investigate the players, there's fewer and fewer to deal with the daily operations, and that pulls guards away from the palace, or that pulls soldiers away from the governor's mansion, whatever you may be coming up with. And now there's a weaker enemy, there are weaker minions around the villain for that final fight because of this. And that leads us into our next section, which are the consequences. So the consequences of the player interference. We've got three things here that the players can mess with a number of different ways, but what happens to the villain's power as a result of the players doing these things? How is the villain's power reduced? For infrastructure meddling, stopping the laborers or convincing them to turn against their employers. This is something where you're kind of hurting them in their wallets and you're delaying the rebuilding process. To me, this is going to reduce the villain's access to resource. So we can show this by having some of the villain's power taken away in ways like maybe if they have spells on their character sheet that they can cast that need material components, maybe they couldn't have as many material components, and maybe they only get to cast that spell once in the encounter instead of twice, or something like that, because they don't have as much access to resources. Maybe they aren't able to wear all of their armor because they've had to cut corners and they're not fully armed and prepared once the final confrontation occurs, which the villain knows is coming. Every villain should know the final confrontation is coming and should never be surprised. They know it's going to happen. They're going to want to arm themselves as heavily as possible, but maybe we tick their AC down a few points to represent that they don't have all their armor because their economy started getting nailed by this. So that's something we could think about. What about the inner circle member? I think a lot of us always picture these sort of final boss fights, so to speak, with the villain. You're going to have the villain and you're going to have minions. And among those minions, you should have some lieutenants, some leadership among the minions, basically just some beefier minions, is really all it boils down to. If the players successfully break down the inner circle, if they're able to get the one inner circle member to hear them out, it might be cool to have a moment where that inner circle member that they've convinced betrays the other inner circle members. So maybe there are 5 of these lieutenants coming at the party in this final showdown, and the one rebels and kills 2 of the lieutenants before they themselves are killed, leaving only 2 lieutenants for the players to have to face total out of the 5. You never want an NPC to get the kill on the villain for the players because that's lame, but to have a situation where the players see 5 council members coming towards them, that's really intimidating because that's way more than any 4th or 5th level party is really going to be facing, especially in a boss fight. And if you describe it well and you lay the scene well, you can really create this tension of, ooh, this fight's going to be hard, but then you can immediately show the fruits of what the players did, the fruits of the choices they made and the actions they took when that one that they successfully planted a seed in turns and is able to kill 2 of the others before they are killed by the faithful. Drops down your numbers, leaves you with a much more fair fight, and it creates a little bit of a cinematic. I would say usually want to get maybe one or maybe one round into the fight before this happens, just so that it's a little bit more in the heat of the moment and feels less like all right, you players stop and wait while I talk about stuff for a while. So that would be something really cool to do if they're able to convince that inner circle member otherwise. If you went the other way, which is you offer the players the opportunity to assassinate a member, well, that's easy. We wanted to balance the fight down to 2 people before, so now we'll just say, if that's the route we're going to go, we'll say the inner council was 3 people, and they assassinated one of them, so now there's only 2. That's still a way that's going to impact the fight. But you want to remind the players that happened. You want to remind them that they made that choice, and you can do that in the setting. Maybe the final fight, the final showdown's in a throne room where you've got the villain's big, giant, evil-looking chair, and then you have the council member chairs all around. And when the party first comes in, all the baddies are seated, but there's one empty chair, and that's the one that they killed. Or maybe there's banners in the hall representing each of the different houses of power that are all supporting your villain, and there's 3 banners, but only 2 lieutenants. You can use description like that, and you can use the setting and the layout of the rooms like that to drive home that the players did something that was important that changed what this scene looks like. Then we have the crackdown of law enforcement, promoting law and order, doing either the propaganda campaign or the wild goose chase. What are the consequences of each of those options? So for the propaganda campaign, I think naturally you're going to be working towards starting a new revolt, a new revolution. And I think if they go this way, I would want to make this a little bit more difficult because you have to talk to a lot of members of the town. It would be hard to get a political movement like this going. It's not like you're going to talk to 1 or 2 NPCs and suddenly this happens. This would be probably 2 full sessions of work by the players if they want to take this path to actively make this happen. And if they were to make this happen, then I would suggest doing a pretty major consequence for successfully pulling this action off. And I think this is one of the rare instances where I would say do a boss fight without minions. Just the villain in that boss fight. And you can use a little bit of dialogue from the boss right as he goes to fight the party that, yeah, his military is either occupied or destroyed from this second revolt so soon after the first revolt. He wasn't able to solidify power long enough to rebuild his army, so his army's weaker and vulnerable. And you starting that new revolution, you've occupied his whole military, and you've left the villain alone, by himself, holed up in his castle, clinging to life and hoping that his army can win. Maybe there's one guard, the captain of his guards, stays behind as a personal bodyguard, but that's it. With a successful propaganda campaign, you've completely either destroyed or occupied the time and attention of the whole military, and that villain is very vulnerable. What about a wild goose chase, committing smaller crimes and distracting the officials from duties? Geez, another spelling error. All right. So with a wild goose chase, again, that's going to mean the guards are pulled away and they're occupied and the villain's left exposed. But I think this would probably require less work from the players than the propaganda campaign. So I would say you could do the same idea of reduced guards around the villain, but probably not nearly as reduced as the propaganda campaign. You could probably represent this as maybe the first couple rounds, the villain is either alone or nearly alone, but the guards aren't gone completely. They're still there. It's just that they're out searching for the party, and when the party goes to fight the villain, these guards, they get word that, hey, the people you're hunting, they're trying to kill the villain right now. And so they're going to turn 180 degrees and they're going to bolt back to the hall or the palace or whatever you've created. And so that can create a cool story moment in your boss fight where maybe the first and second round pass and the boss gets weakened and they're taking them down in hit points and the party's breaking them down a little bit in terms of power. But then right before the round or two in which the party is going to get the killing blow, right when the villain is at his most vulnerable and you know the players are maybe 1 to 2 rounds away from getting that kill, the guards burst in and add that complication to the encounter. I think that is different enough from the results of the propaganda campaign to still be its own thing, but still be a powerful and influential thing that the players are now able to deal with. So we've got those things laid out about the villain. Then, last step is we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at the NPCs we've created and kind of figure out how they fit into these ideas. So we'll start off with, let's actually go bottom to top this time. Let's start out with the local authority or mentor. I think this is a really, really good spot for that inner circle member that's vulnerable to players. They can serve as a local authority and give crucial information to the players about the bad guy, but if they choose to do the persuasion road of dealing with the inner circle member, they can become a mentor type figure for the players and help in stopping the bad guy. I think that could be a good spot there. So that's a good thing to think about. And knowing crucial information about the bad guy, they might know the crucial information about the crackdown. They might be able to suggest how we respond to the crackdown. It could be their suggestion to start the propaganda campaign or their suggestion to lead a wild goose chase, whatever it may be. What about the shopkeeper? But what does the shopkeeper know? We know they're not going to know as much as the innkeeper, but I want them to know something. I want them to have some level of information. Being that they're a business owner, specifically a merchant business owner as opposed to the tavern keeper, it might make sense for them to know about the infrastructure rebuilding because that's going to be affecting their ability to get in shipments of new supplies or just the general running of their business. So it makes sense to me that the shopkeeper is going to be the one to suggest the idea of breaking down the infrastructure. And I think the shopkeeper, they're an economist. They just want money. They don't really care who's in power as long as they're able to successfully run their business. I think that's a good way to kind of play a shopkeeper at this level. And because of that, the villain being in power is only an issue for the shopkeeper because of the rebellion. The shopkeeper's a moderate, like we talked about earlier. They're a moderate person. They're not really for the villain, but they're also not really against the villain. The problem they have is that this villain caused a revolution, and that revolution hurt this shopkeeper's profits. Maybe part of his shop has been damaged or burned, or windows are broken out because of the revolt, and he hasn't even been able to repair those yet. That might be a nice little touch to show through the descriptions of the players that he hasn't even recovered his own shop yet. So he's really not liking the idea of a revolt. So he probably doesn't want a revolt to happen again. And for that reason, he's drifting from moderate to radical and wanting to get that villain out of power. Because if that person being in power leads to revolts, he doesn't want him in power. So I think it makes sense for him to go, hey, my infrastructure is terrible and it's hurting my business. I know that's happening all across town. If you were to find a way to break that down even more, you're going to be able to get this guy out of here for me, and hopefully we can get a leader who will actually let me make a decent profit. Lastly, let's take a look at the innkeeper. What does the innkeeper know? The town gossip. He's going to know a good number of things. He's going to know, I think, who the moderates are, who the faithful are, and who the radicals are. He's going to know who and where they are. He's going to know how to get in touch with them, and that's going to help the players if they want to do that propaganda campaign. He's also going to know who the inner circle members are, and he can be a great way to let the inner circle member who could be switched known to the players, a way to give the players information about, hey, talk to this guy, because I don't think he's quite as in on it as everyone else is. Or maybe it's his wife who runs it instead of him. Maybe he's kind of a drunkard, and the owner is a drunkard, but his wife runs the place and she handles everything. I like in my games to have women taking a more active role in this kind of stuff, and rather than going with the stereotypical, oh, well, they know all the gossip, I think she could be the one to instigate the wild goose chase. Maybe she's sick and tired of the police constantly raiding and double checking that the tavern's actually doing what they're supposed to do, and making sure their books are good, making sure they're not selling any kind of illicit substances, or drinks that are banned or anything like that. She's tired of being interfered with, and enough is enough for her. So maybe she's the one who's got a little bit more of a renegade spirit and suggests, hey, why don't you hit a few places? I'll tell you what, we've got decent insurance. Rob us. I'll tell the authorities you robbed us, and I'll give descriptions to start that wild goose chase, and then that gives the players sort of a little toe dip in the water of that technique and of that strategy in a safe way, where they're not worried about pissing off an NPC or upsetting someone that could be helpful later. It kind of opens the door to be like, no, it's cool, it's okay, well, I'll help you stage it. I think that could be really fun as well.
Being flexible, giving your players lots of options, and making choices meaningful doesn't have to mean more work. Usually, it means less. The trick is knowing where and how to apply your work. By focusing on a short list of necessary locations, necessary NPCs, and clear objectives for both the party and the villain, we leave the rest up to our players. As a GM, you only have to devise the what and the where, not the how. Thanks for choosing to spend your time today with us here at the Upstairs Table. If you'd like to support the channel and see more videos like this, please subscribe and click on the bell to get notifications when new videos come out. I mostly play Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but I'm always going to do my best to keep the advice as universally applicable as possible. If you're a player, share this video with your GM. And if you're a GM, share it with your players to inspire them. Maybe you can stop being a forever GM. If you've got a killer world building tip, or you want to share how you avoid railroading at your table, leave it in a comment below. Always spread love and joy, and remember, there's room for everyone at the table.